The room had gone completely quiet. Not the practiced quiet of a formal papal audience, where silence is a protocol. This was something else. The 6 people standing in that small room inside the Apostolic Palace had traveled 4,000 miles for this moment, and now that it had arrived, none of them could move. They were old. Several of them had white hair. One leaned on a cane. One had been helped to a chair because her knees no longer permitted extended standing. They had known this man before any of this existed. Before the white cassock. Before the title. Before the smoke above the Sistine Chapel on a May afternoon that had made them all stop whatever they were doing and stare at their televisions and feel something they did not immediately have words for. They had known him as Bobby. He stood in the doorway for nearly half a minute. He did not speak. His eyes moved from face to face, slowly, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone reading something written in a language they once knew fluently and are now finding their way back into. Each face was 60 years older than the last time he had seen it. Each one was also, unmistakably, exactly itself. He stopped when he reached the last face in the room. The man standing slightly apart from the others, the way he had always stood. A little separate, watchful. The Pope said his name, just his name, barely above a whisper. The way you say the name of something you had stopped believing you would ever recover. The man covered his face with both hands, and the room came apart in the most beautiful way a room can come apart. This is the story of what brought them there. And what happened after the door closed. It began, the way most of the things that matter in Leo XIV's papacy have begun, without announcement. The morning of March 20th was dark and wet, Rome having received a light rain in the overnight hours that left the cobblestones outside the Apostolic Palace glistening in the pre-dawn quiet. The Pope was in his private chapel before 5, which was not unusual. Those who worked in close orbit around him had learned across the 10 months of his pontificate to read his early mornings the way navigators read water, for depth, for current, for what was moving underneath the surface. Some mornings he emerged from the chapel carrying a clarity that made everything around him move faster. Some mornings he emerged carrying a silence that was not trouble exactly, but weight. A weight that required its own respect. That morning, his secretary, Father Teodoro Ibez, a methodical Spaniard who had been in Vatican service for 14 years, noted that the Pope remained in the chapel considerably longer than his usual hour. When he finally emerged and took his coffee standing at the window, as was his custom, he read through the morning correspondence with the same focus he brought to everything. But Ibez noticed that he paused for a longer time than usual on one particular letter. Not a diplomatic cable. Not a dicastery report. A handwritten letter on lined paper, the script slightly unsteady in the specific way that age makes handwriting unsteady, as though the pen requires more deliberate instruction than it once did. The letter had taken 3 weeks to arrive. It had been forwarded through the Archdiocese of Chicago and then through the Vatican's General Correspondence Office, passing through 3 sets of hands before landing on the papal desk, which receives thousands of pieces of mail each week, the majority of which are handled by staff according to a careful triage system, and only a fraction of which ever reach the Pope's own eyes. This one had been flagged by a young staff reader who had a sense for the letters that were not form correspondence or petition or request, but something rarer, letters that were simply personal. The woman who wrote it was 70 years old. Her name was Elena Marchetti, now Elena Dorsey, and she had been in the 3rd grade at St. Anthony's Parish School in a small neighborhood on the south side of Chicago in 1964. She wrote that she had watched the white smoke on her kitchen television on the afternoon of May 8, 2025, with her grandchildren in the room, and that when she understood what had happened, when the name was read aloud and she recognized it, she had wept in a way that confused and slightly alarmed the grandchildren. She had tried to explain why. She had found it difficult. She wrote that there was a small group of them, people from the same parish, the same school, the same block in some cases, who had stayed loosely in contact across the decades, the way groups of childhood friends stay in contact when no one has made a formal decision to do so, but everyone has quietly decided that the connection is worth maintaining. She wrote that they had gathered, informally, in the weeks after the election, at someone's kitchen table, and talked about the boy they had known, about the qualities that had apparently traveled with him across half a century and landed him in the most extraordinary position in the history of their faith. She was not asking for anything, she was careful to say. She understood that such things were not simply arranged. She only wanted him to know that they thought of him, that they prayed for him, that somewhere in a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, a small group of people who had known him before any of this began still called him by his childhood name. She signed it with 7 names. The Pope read the letter twice. Then he turned to Ibez and said, "Find them." Ibez had heard the Pope make requests that were simple in phrasing and considerable in complexity before. He recognized this as one of them. Within 72 hours, involving the Vatican Secretariat of State, a retired Monsignor in Chicago who had connections to the parish network, and a series of phone calls that produced varying degrees of disbelief at the receiving end, all 7 names had been located. 5 were in the Chicago area. 1 had moved to Indiana. 1 was in Milwaukee. The letter that arrived at Elena Dorsey's house on the afternoon of March 21st was not a form letter. It was 4 paragraphs, handwritten, in English, on cream Vatican stationery bearing the seal of the Holy See. It said that the Holy Father had read her letter carefully and with considerable emotion. It said that if they were willing, and if their health permitted, he would be honored to receive them in Rome on the afternoon of March 22nd. Travel and accommodation had been arranged. All they needed to do was say yes. Elena read it standing at her kitchen counter. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, which was not something she typically did. She was not alone in her reaction. Thomas Kalinowski, 72, a retired high school principal from Oak Park who had been in the same 5th grade class as Bobby Prevost, and remembered him primarily as the person who somehow never seemed to be stressed about anything despite always being at the top of every academic ranking, received his phone call from a Vatican administrative office on Tuesday afternoon and spent the first 45 seconds of the conversation entirely convinced that one of his former students was playing an elaborate joke. When he finally accepted that the voice on the other end was real and the Vatican return number was real, he walked to his back porch and stood there for a while in the cold. His wife found him there. He told her he needed to pack a bag. Rosaria Fiore, who had grown up 3 doors down from the Prevost family and who still had a photograph from a First Communion ceremony in the early 1960s, in which a serious-faced boy stood to her left, with his hands precisely folded and his gaze directed at something outside the frame, had the specific experience of a woman for whom something deeply private has suddenly become publicly real. She carried that photograph to Rome inside her coat pocket. Sister Agatha Brennan, now 83, was the last surviving member of the teaching faculty from St. Anthony's Parish School who had been there during the years in question. She was living in a retirement community in Indiana and had been, by her own account, extremely clear with her doctor that his concerns about the journey were his concerns and not hers. She arrived at O'Hare Airport in a wheelchair, declined assistance boarding, and once on the plane read her breviary for most of the flight, with the composure of someone for whom even a transatlantic journey in advanced age presents no particular occasion for drama. The 7th member of the group was a man named Daniel Rossi. He had been Bobby Prevost's closest friend from the age of 7 through the age of 12, when Daniel's family had relocated to St. Louis. The 2 boys had written letters for a while, real paper letters in real envelopes, and then had gone quiet the way children go quiet when geography intervenes, and no one has yet invented the technology that collapses distance. Daniel was now 70, a retired electrician, and he had followed the news of the papal election sitting alone in his apartment in Milwaukee, with the particular private intensity of someone watching history intersect with personal memory. When the Vatican called, he thought for a long moment that he was having an unusual dream. Then he said yes so quickly that the administrator on the other end of the call appeared briefly startled. Rome on the morning of March 22nd was the Rome that rewards the people who show up for it in the shoulder seasons, before the summer crowds, when the light is still low enough to do justice to what the stones have seen. The group arrived at Fiumicino Airport on a direct overnight flight and were met by a Vatican representative whose calm was so complete and whose English was so precise that Elena Dorsey later described him as a person who seemed to have been specifically designed for the purpose of making overwhelmed Americans feel that everything was being handled. They were taken to a residence maintained by the Holy See for private guests, a quiet building just outside the Vatican walls, where they were given rooms and breakfast and the simple instruction that they would meet the Holy Father at 4 o'clock in a private room in the Apostolic Palace. No press, no ceremony, no cameras. The Holy Father had requested it specifically. Thomas Kalinowski, adjusting the collar of his good shirt, looked around at the others over breakfast and said, "I just want everyone to know that I have mentally prepared for this for 12 hours, and I am still completely unprepared." Nobody disagreed. Daniel Rossi had barely spoken since landing. He sat at breakfast with his coffee and looked out the window at the dome of St. Peter's rising above the Roman rooftops in the morning light, and he thought about a winter afternoon in 1968, when he and Bobby Prevost had built something in the snow in Bobby's backyard that was intended to be a fort, and had become something more architectural and more ambitious, and had eventually collapsed, and they had both laughed so hard they fell down. And he had thought at the time, and many times since, that it was one of the best afternoons of his life. He had not seen the man that boy became since his family moved south. He had watched him from the distance that life imposes on things it separates, tracking the trajectory through news items and church publications and the occasional documentary. Watching the trajectory with the quiet, astonished pride of someone whose relationship to the subject is personal in a way that no journalist covering the story could ever fully know. Elena found him at the window after breakfast. "Do you think he's still the same?" she asked. Daniel considered this for a long moment. "I think he's still himself," he said. "That's not exactly the same thing, but I think it might be better." In the Apostolic Palace, the afternoon moved at the Pope's usual pace, which is to say purposefully, without wasted motion, fully present to each thing in sequence. He had a full schedule. He moved through it. Ibez, who knew the map of his attention as well as anyone alive, noticed that the Pope checked the time more than he usually did. Not impatiently, the way you check the time when you are waiting for something that matters, and you are slightly afraid of how much it matters. At 10 minutes to 4, Leo excused himself from his final meeting and walked through the long corridor of the Apostolic Palace toward the small reception room. He paused outside the door. Ibez, following at a respectful distance, watched him stand there with his hand not quite touching the handle. The Pope's back was to him, but Ibez had been in close proximity to this man through enough significant moments to know what certain kinds of stillness meant. This stillness meant, "I am deciding whether I am ready." Then he opened the door. They were standing. All 7 of them, in their good clothes, with the specific posture of people who have been trying very hard to appear composed for a long enough time that the effort is beginning to show. Rosaria had the photograph in her coat pocket and had been periodically confirming it was still there. Thomas had his hands clasped in front of him in a way that suggested he was not entirely sure what else to do with them. Sister Agatha sat in the chair that had been placed for her, hands folded, ready, the way she had always been ready for everything. The Pope stopped inside the doorway. He stood there and looked at them, his white cassock, simple and unadorned except for the cross at his chest, his white hair. The face of a man who had carried 7 decades of living, and the last 10 months of something that would have bent most people in half, and who had arrived at a particular quality of presence that people who encountered him often struggled to describe afterward, and that those who knew him from before recognized immediately as having been there all along, just as it was now, simply more so. He looked at each of them. His gaze moved slowly from face to face the way you move through a room of things you love, not rushing, wanting each one to have its full moment of recognition. When he reached Daniel Rossi, standing slightly apart at the end of the line, he went still. Then he said Daniel's name, quietly. Just the name. The way you say the name of something you thought was gone. Daniel covered his face. Elena made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite something else, but was unmistakably the sound of 60 years arriving all at once. Thomas looked at the ceiling and pressed his lips together, and did not succeed in the composure he was attempting. Sister Agatha sat in her chair and let the tears come with the undisturbed dignity of a woman who has spent 83 years making peace with her emotions and no longer sees any reason to hide them. Leo walked into the room. He went first to Sister Agatha, lowered himself to her level, and took her hands in both of his. He said something to her that only she heard. She closed her eyes and nodded, and when she opened them again, they were bright. He went around the room. He took each person one by one, not the formal papal greeting, not the careful choreography of public embrace, the full, unguarded, sustained embrace of a man returning to people who knew him before the weight of the world was placed on his shoulders, and who therefore knew him in a way that no one who met him afterward could ever entirely replicate. When he reached Daniel, they held each other for a long time. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. They stayed for nearly 2 hours. Ibez had scheduled 45 minutes and had quietly moved the next appointment back as a precaution. The precaution proved, as it turned out, necessary. They sat and they talked. Not about doctrine or reform or the extraordinary institutional pressures that currently surrounded the pontificate. They talked about the parish school in the 1960s, about a particular nun whose disciplinary methods had left an impression on all of them that apparently 5 decades had done nothing to diminish, about the winter the church boiler failed and the congregation wore their coats to Sunday Mass for 3 weeks, including the pastor, who wore his over his vestments and pretended this was completely normal, about a game played in the schoolyard whose rules had by now been lost, but whose spirit they all remembered perfectly, a game that had involved a great deal of running and an unclear scoring system and the near-total absence of any adult supervision, about the smell of the church on Sunday morning, candle wax and incense and wood polish and the wool of people's winter coats, the smell that gets into you early if you grow up inside it and that finds you, decades later, in other churches in other countries and brings the whole of your childhood back in a single breath. Leo listened more than he spoke. Everyone noticed this. The man had become the spiritual leader of 1.5 billion people, and he sat in this room with the attentiveness of someone for whom the person in front of him was the most important person in the world. When Elena talked about her grandchildren, he asked their names and asked about each one. When Thomas described a health scare the previous year, Leo set down his cup and gave him his full attention, not to solve anything, not to offer a formulation, but simply to receive what was being shared and let the person sharing it know that it had been heard. At some point, Rosaria reached into her coat pocket and produced the photograph from 1963. She passed it across to Leo, who held it in both hands, the small, serious boy with his hands folded, looking at something outside the frame. "I was always like that," he said, in a tone that was not quite a compliment to himself. "You were focused," Sister Agatha said, with the precision of a woman who had spent 50 years distinguishing between children who were focused and children who were merely serious. "They are not the same thing." He looked at her. "You always had the right word for it." "I always had the right word for everything," she said pleasantly. That was rather the point. The room laughed, genuinely, uncomplicated, the kind of laughter that clears everything it moves through. In the warmth that followed the laughter, in the easy silence that settles between people who have stopped performing for one another, Leo said something that none of them expected. He said that there had been a moment, after finishing his studies, when he had stood in his room in Chicago trying to decide whether to go to Rome. He had been 22. He had never been to Europe. He had known no one there. The whole thing had seemed, as he put it without dressing it up, impossibly large. He said his mother had asked him one question. She had asked, "When you imagine yourself not going, what do you feel?" He had said, "Relieved." She had asked, "And when you imagine yourself going?" He had said, "Terrified." She had said, "Those are different things. Relieved means you're avoiding something. Terrified means it matters." The room held that for a moment. She was usually right, he said, about most things. Elena looked at her hands and then back at him. "Your mother was something, Bobby," she said. "She really was." "Yes," he said simply. "She was." Near the end of the afternoon, as the Roman light through the windows was shifting toward the long gold of evening, Thomas Kalinowski, who had been watching the Pope with the quiet evaluating attention he had developed across decades of observing people under circumstances they hadn't chosen, asked the question that none of the others had quite found the way to ask. "Bobby," he said, and then stopped and looked at the white cassock. Leo looked at him. "Please," he said. Thomas nodded. "Are you happy?" The room went still in the specific way rooms go still when a question lands that is too sincere to be answered quickly. Leo sat with it. He did not deflect it or elevate it or translate it into something more manageable. He looked at Thomas with the directness that those who knew him had come to recognize as something essential about him. The refusal to meet a genuine question with anything other than genuine thought. "I am called," he said finally. "And I am grateful. Whether those two things always feel like happiness, I'm not certain that happiness is exactly the word for what this is." He paused. "But I would not give it back. Not for anything." Thomas held his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded once. The nod of someone who has received an honest answer and knows it for what it is. "Good enough," Thomas said. Elena reached over and took the Pope's hand. He let her. They left as the evening bells began to ring across the city. The Vatican car took them back through the Roman streets in the fading light, and they sat quietly in the way people sit when they are carrying something that has just been given to them and do not want to disturb it with too many words. In the small reception room, Ibez found the Pope sitting in the low light, not kneeling. Simply sitting, hands open on his knees, looking at nothing particular. Ibez stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he withdrew silently and closed the door behind him. Outside, Rome was going about the business of its evening. The bells finished their call. The last tourists crossed the piazza. The lights came on one by one in the old buildings that have watched everything that has ever happened in this city, the fall of empires and the rise of movements, and the 10,000 ordinary evenings that constitute the actual texture of a human life. Inside the chapel, the man who was also Robert Francis Prevost of the south side of Chicago sat with the names of 7 people still present in the room with him, not as ghosts, as something more useful than ghosts, as anchors, the kind that hold you to the real shape of yourself when the weight of what you've become threatens to be the only thing you can feel. A man who carries the spiritual weight of over 1 billion people had just been brought entirely back to himself by the sound of his own name spoken without any title attached to it. By people who remembered him before, who remembered the sandwich he shared with a girl who forgot her lunch, who remembered the afternoon the snow fort collapsed and they both laughed until they fell down, who had come 4,000 miles to sit in a plain room and say, "We know who you are. We have always known who you are. And we are still here." There was a word for that. He had studied it in Latin, in the long tradition he now carried, in the theology of unearned and unasked for gift. The word was grace, not announced by anything spectacular, not requiring an explanation, just 2 old friends holding each other in a room in Rome. Just a name, spoken softly, breaking something open in the best possible way. He sat with it until the last bell finished. Then he rose, straightened his cassock, and walked back into the corridor where the world was still waiting for him, as the world always is. He was ready. Like this story, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.